So, Ari, we have a couple of things to talk about in terms of the vote, the right to people to vote in this country as it's being abridged in different places around the country. We may see hundreds of thousands of people kicked off the voter rolls in Wisconsin. We can talk about that. But let's start with, and you also have a massive piece in Mother Jones about Trump's stealth plan to preserve white electoral power. We will get to that in a moment. But let's start in Florida, where in 2018, the citizenry of Florida decided that people who have served their time in prison for felonies and have been released from prison deserve to have the right to vote restored to them. And we were talking about what I think it's 1.4 million people who were presumably eligible for a right to vote. And the Republicans in Florida apparently are very nervous about that prospect.
They are, Sam, and this has really been a remarkable story, remarkable in both a positive and a negative sense. It's remarkable because Florida had one of the worst records of any state, if not the worst record of any state, when it came to disenfranchising people with past felony convictions. Florida is one of the only states in the country that didn't allow you to vote even after you had served your time. That disenfranchised over 1.5 million people. In November 2018, the voters of Florida said they wanted to restore voting rights to people with past felony convictions after they had completed probation and parole. It seemed pretty simple. If you had a clean record, you would be able to vote unless you were convicted of certain crimes like murder or a sexual crime. But that was pretty easily understood. Then, in the spring of last year, the Florida legislature got involved. Florida's Republican-controlled legislature got involved. And they significantly undermined this ballot initiative, and they significantly changed the meaning of the law. And they said that under this law, you didn't just have to serve your time. You had to pay off what they called all fines, fees, and restitution to be able to vote, meaning that if you had a sentence and your sentence included a very large financial penalty, or even if your sentence included the fact that you were essentially paying off your incarceration, which is Florida's one of those states that does that, people owed tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, that the state of Florida knew they were never going to be able to pay back, but made them pay anyway. And now the state was saying, unless you pay off all of this money, you're not going to be able to vote. And that's where things stand right now.
And all right, so do we have a sense of how many of these sentencing documents? Because my understanding is the Supreme Court basically said, and this is Florida Supreme Court, and we should add that the Florida Supreme Court is made up of a majority of people picked by the last Republican governor there. Is that right, Rick Scott?
Yes, and now it also has people from the new Republican governor, Ron DeSantis. So it's a heavily, heavily Republican-dominated state Supreme Court.
And my understanding is the state Supreme Court said within the four corners, literally they said within the four corners of the sentencing document. Do we know how many people who are sentenced, and of this, cohort of 1.4 million people who have been released from prison, how many of them had such fines or fees or the call for restitution within their literal sentencing document?
Well, one of the big problems here is that Florida doesn't have a database of how much everybody owes. So that makes it very, very difficult to enforce the law that the Florida legislature passed because people don't know how much they owe. There has been research done into this. The best research I've seen is by Daniel Smith, who's a professor at the University of Florida. He testified as an expert on behalf of the ACLU, who's brought numerous lawsuits challenging this law by the Florida legislature. And he did a review of 48 of the 67 counties in Florida, and he found that 80% of people had some sort of fine or fee or restitution attached to their sentence, meaning that if 80% can't afford, if you assume that 80% of people have some sort of financial penalty attached to their sentence, and we don't know how many can afford it to pay it off. Let's just say none of them can afford to pay it off. That would mean that of the 1.4 million people that were set to get their right to vote back, more than 1 million people would be disenfranchised, something like 1.1 or 1.2 million people, which would just be an absolutely staggering number of people to say you're going to get the right to vote back, and then say, oh, by the way, you're not going to get the right to vote back unless you can afford to pay off all of your fines.
I have two questions that remain. One is practical and one is from a legal perspective. From a practical standpoint, does Florida now need to create a database of this? I mean, if I am I was formerly a convict, I go in to register. They say you were formerly a convict. Did you pay off your fees? I did. How would they go about? Like, do I need to come back with a receipt, or do they and prove, show it to them? I mean, is there a mechanics to this?
Florida claims they're going to create this database. The problem is some of these sentences are very old, like going back to the 70s and 80s, and it's going to be very difficult for them to get accurate information, and also to know whether it's up to date, right? Because you might have gotten some sort of financial penalty 20 years ago, but you're not necessarily going to get a receipt saying it's all been paid off 20 years later. I mean, and so the whole thing is just a complete and total mess. And what's going to happen?
And that's by design.
Yeah,
that's by design. Right?
It's by design, exactly. This was a very simple thing, Sam. If you had completed probation and parole, which everyone can prove, and you weren't convicted of a certain really bad crime like murder or sexual offense, which anyone can prove, then you're eligible to vote. So it was actually very simple what the people were voting on. Now it's become incredibly complicated by design, as you say, so that people who are actually eligible to vote, who may not owe any money, they're going to be afraid to register for fear that they're going to make some sort of mistake that's going to land them potentially back in jail. We've seen very aggressive prosecutions already in other states like Texas for voter fraud, where a black woman in Texas, for example, who voted on supervised release when she didn't realize she was ineligible, got 5 years in prison. So, I mean, that's going to have a chilling effect. The second thing that's happened is tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million people or more, are going to actually owe money, not be able to pay them off, and then not be able to vote. Now, the rub here is that a federal court also ruled in this case, and the federal court told the state of Florida, you need to create some mechanism so that people who can't afford to pay off their fines still can be able to vote, meaning you can't deny someone the ability to vote just because they're too poor to pay off their fine. So Florida has to create that system as well for people to show that they can't afford to pay, but they can still vote, and they haven't done that either. So there's just a ton of confusion for something that was actually very simple at the end of the day.
Well, like you say, that's probably by design. I have just one last question on that legal stuff, and then we got to take a break. Would the Supreme Court ever weigh in and say, hey, wait a second, this is a poll tax? That's illegal.
I don't think this Supreme Court's going to say that.
Right. Okay.
I haven't met a single voting restriction that John Roberts and the conservative justices on the Supreme Court haven't liked. So I'm very skeptical that the Supreme Court would give any sort of sweeping ruling here and would overturn what other Republican justices are saying. That said, they might not hear the court. The federal courts and the lower courts may say to the state of Florida, you need to do something. It may not be a perfect solution, but you need to do something that in the most extreme cases where people can't afford to pay off their fines, they're still able to vote. But again, the Florida legislature hasn't done that. So voting rights for, at this point, 1.4 million people are up in the air right now in Florida.
In the meantime, you've written a blockbuster piece in Mother Jones about Trump's, what you call Trump's stealth plan to preserve white electoral power. Tell us about this plan.
Well, thank you, Sam. So basically, you remember when the Trump administration proposed that there would be a citizenship question on the 2020 census. That was blocked by the Supreme Court in a very surprising decision by the conservative Supreme Court, which basically said the Trump administration lied about their reasons for adding this question. The Trump administration tried to put it on the form anyway, but eventually backed down. But at the same time that Trump announced that he wasn't going to push any more for the citizenship question, he did another thing to try to influence the census in his favor and the Republican Party's favor, which is he called for an executive order basically saying that every agency in the government had to provide citizenship information on people in the U.S., despite not having this question on the census. And then it would be used for redistricting purposes, because currently districts are drawn in such a way that everyone is counted. They're based on total population. What Trump wants to do is he wants to exclude certain people from counting. He wants only voters to count in terms of total representation. He wants to exclude children and non-citizens. So those that are under 18 and not eligible to vote, or those that aren't citizens and are not eligible to vote, so that they don't count when districts are drawn. So why does this matter? Because if you don't count certain communities, particularly if you don't count children, if you don't count non-citizens when you're drawing legislative districts, that means that that is going to take power away from younger, more diverse areas that are more likely to be represented by Democrats, and it's going to shift power to wider, more conservative, and more Republican areas with fewer kids and fewer non-citizens, both legal and undocumented. So this is very much an under-the-radar thing that has gotten very little attention, but it has the power, after states redraw their districts in the next census, to really redefine political representation in America.
Is there any recourse? Well, I just want to remind people that as surprising as that Supreme Court ruling on the census was, it did come in the wake of a revelation of documents that showed that the Department of Justice was was basically lying as to why it was requesting this question. Like literally, it showed that the grandfather Hofeller, I'm sorry, the grandfather of gerrymandering, basically fed them this line as a way of justifying it. So surprising, but not to their credit per se. But in this instance that you're talking about, in this attempt to change the one person, one vote, I guess is the way to express it. Is there a way to push back on this?
Yeah. So the way it works is that we do a census in 2020. After we do the census in 2020, states are going to begin redistricting both legislative and congressional districts based on the census data. And so what the Census Bureau is going to do is they're going to give the citizenship data to states. And then states can decide whether or not they are going to draw districts that exclude certain people from counting. Heretofore, no state has done this. And actually, there was an effort by conservative groups to try to force the state of Texas to draw districts in such a manner. They declined to do it in 2015, but there's going to be a renewed effort to try to get conservative states in particular to draw districts that exclude children and exclude non-citizens from counting. But the first thing that can happen is states can refuse to do this. And I imagine many states, if not most states, would refuse to do this, but I think there are still other states that are looking into it. The second thing is that if a Democrat is elected president in 2020, they can block the release of the citizenship data altogether. They can tell the Census Bureau, you're not giving this data to states. Now, that would, I think, provoke lawsuits, but nonetheless, the next president has that power. So all of this stuff is going to play out based on the results of the 2020 election. But I started writing about this now because it's something that I'm very, very concerned about, that I think if you changed how districts are drawn, it would be a massive shift in representation, and it would really change the whole meaning of one person, one vote, because one person, one vote, even though it's called one person, one vote, really has been interpreted as meaning everybody counts. Everyone is entitled to equal representation, no matter how old they are, no matter where they live, no matter what their status is. And what the Trump administration is saying is, no, we only want to count those people that are eligible to vote. And you're talking about excluding millions and millions and millions of people from political representation. And it would have a massive shift in a state like Texas, where so much of the demographic change is based on young people and based on people of color, in particular Latinos. It would essentially erase all of the demographic change in Texas and create a very, very white, heavily Republican state, as opposed to a state that is far more diverse and is changing rapidly and where Democrats are gaining power.
And this is also, I mean, this is about resources, right? I mean, this is ultimately the purpose of counting these people in the context of a district is to know what kind of resources you want, right? Because it's not just registered voters who drive on the highways. It's not just registered voters who drink the water, right? I mean, this is all about the political power is supposedly divvied up in these districts as a way to make sure that the resources necessary for these districts are provided.
Exactly. And I mean, that's why it makes sense to count everyone, because everyone is a constituent. Everyone has needs. And I went down to Texas and I interviewed a Latina lawmaker by the name of Carol Alvarado, who represents a very diverse, a very young district in Houston. And I said, do you guys consider voters your constituents, or do you consider everyone your constituents? And she says, I consider everyone my constituents. I go to talk to kids at school and they're not voters, but I care what happens to their schools. And I deal with non-citizens all the time. And I care what happens to them. I care about a sane immigration policy and all of these other things. And so if you only start caring about the needs of voters, then you're ignoring a ton of people who are under the age of 18 and are not eligible to vote. They suddenly aren't counted. And you're also not including a whole lot of people that are non-citizens, some of whom are here legally and some of whom are here undocumented, but all of whom are working, paying taxes and contributing to their community. And what would happen as a result of this is that because districts have to be roughly equal in population, districts that have more kids and more non-citizens would have to massively increase their population to have enough voting age citizens that are equal to another district. So that would mean like a heavily Latino district in Texas might have to grow from 600,000 people to 1.2 million people, which would just put an insane amount of stress on the lawmakers representing these crazy inflated districts that suddenly have all these constituents that aren't being counted.
It would also mimic, in some ways, like the way that this distortion of democracy that we see in the Senate and that we see from things like the Electoral College. Ari Berman, thanks so much for your time today. We will link to that piece in Mother Jones, Trump's stealth plan to preserve white electoral power. Great piece. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Sam. Always great to talk to you.